Let us pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Well, we just finished a fabulous Christmas time. I hope everybody had a wonderful Christmas this year. And how could it not be wonderful as we celebrate God coming to earth in the form of a little baby? Jesus, born in a manger in the city of David of Bethlehem. It is God who has come to us, squeezed into that little body. But as we all know, Jesus was also a man, a human. Somehow, in a way that's hard to understand, Jesus has 100% of God's DNA and 100% of human DNA. You figure it out. But Jesus was not only human. He wasn't humanity. He was a particular human. He was Jesus, and he had things that made him Jesus. One of the things that made Jesus Jesus is that he was there at a particular time in history, and he had a particular culture through which he expressed himself. So that we look at the words of Christ as being universal truths, as being things that everyone can gather around the Gospels. All of that is said in the manner of a first century Palestinian Jew. Well, wait a minute. There are people who never were and never will be Jewish who follow Christ. There are people in far-flung corners of the world who may never even have heard of Palestine or know anything about the first century. They don't know, perhaps, about Moses or the Torah or all the other religious traditions of Judaism. They may not know about the history. So how could Jesus possibly be relevant to so many people? They don't know the culture from which Jesus is talking, and yet somehow Jesus is meaningful to so many people, billions of people now. The word spread from that little town in Bethlehem all around the world. People who don't know anything. How did that happen? How could a first century itinerant poor Jew speak meaningfully to so many people? Well, of course, we all know that the church, for 1,500 years, when it was just the Roman Catholic Church, everybody agreed on everything, right? Everybody worshiped exactly the same way. There was no question. They did it in Latin. It was done this way, and that was that, right? Y'all know your church history? You know I'm lying, okay? There were lots of disagreements about this and that or the other thing, about the word of Jesus, the words of the Bible, what was going on. And of course, we have this kind of a myopic view because we tend to think of the Roman Catholic Church as being the only Christian church that existed in those ancient times, and that's not true at all. There was the Eastern Church, which we now call Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox. They existed completely, well, not always, but completely independent eventually of the Roman Catholic Church. There's churches in Syria. The oldest church in the world, oldest Christian church in the world, some people think is in Ethiopia. All right? That somehow they got organized quickly. I don't know if that's true, but my point is, they're all over the place. They weren't so, and did the Syrian church always agree with the Roman Catholic Church? I'll give you a big hint. No. They had differences, sometimes very serious differences about their Christology, how they looked at Christ, or their theology, how they looked at God. And okay, so there was all that difference. But when Luther came along and we had the Protestant Reformation, well, then everybody began worshiping the same, right? Right. The only difference was it was in your own language. You didn't have to do it in Latin anymore. That was the only difference. Right. They fought wars over some of their differences in Christology and theology. No. And there's some big differences too. Have you ever heard of predestination? Not too popular these days, but for a long time, some people believed that when you were born, God already knew whether you were going to go to heaven or to be damned. That's actually called double predestination. Being double doesn't make it any better. I can really see that. All right? So you essentially, and how did you know if you were predestined to be saved? You were in church. Let me see. You might get a little problem with that. But people disagreed about, that's a pretty fundamental thing to disagree about. People disagreed about all sorts of things. The truth of the matter is that cultures all over the world worship differently. They have different symbols, they use different words, they have different candles, they have different language. Some use Bibles that are a little bit different, have books that we don't include in our Bible here. Some, the Eastern Orthodox Church, really is focused on the divinity of Christ, while here our Protestant churches generally are more focused on the humanity of Christ. How does this work? How can that possibly be? Well, this morning you're going to get to learn your $64,000 word, all right? And that word is syncretism, S-Y-N-C-R-E-T-I-S-M, or syncretic. What it means is you take cultural symbols and you move them into your religious expression. And there are people who think that syncretism is awful, right? There really should just be one thing, right? One way in which we worship Christ. But whether you think it's awful or not, it's absolutely true. It's what every culture has done. Jesus Christ himself, his truths are cultureless. That's why we call them universal truths. And they are therefore quite easily translated from the Palestinian Aramaic society that Jesus was in into your society, whether it's here in North Vancouver or in northern Mongolia. It's called syncretism. It's a way for people to take what is more or less part of their daily lives, their culture, and link it with Christ, so that Christ kind of gets rolled up in that whole thing as well. And that's why we have so many different forms of worship. Cultural artifacts absorbed into religious expression. The bottom line is there's simply no one single way to worship Jesus Christ. But somehow we got this in our heads, that we should all kind of be the same. And I think most of us here realize that's not necessarily the case, but I remember for the Methodists in particular, in the 1950s and 60s, they began to think of church on a franchise model. In fact, some people called it that, the franchise model of church. And it's exactly what you're thinking. It's as if, you go into a McDonald's here in Salmon Creek, or you go into a McDonald's in Tallahassee, Florida, and they're basically the same. Right? They're just not different. So if you went into a Methodist church somewhere and then went into a different Methodist somewhere else, it would be exactly the same. How do you think that worked out? Not that well. It might have for a while, but the truth of the matter is, even within our own culture, we each have, I don't know how else to say it, different ways in which our bell gets rung. Different ways in which we see Christ, find Christ, seek Christ, can be a part of Christ. And so that is what we're doing now here at Salmon Creek. We have two services. We have traditional at 8:30, we have modern at 10:30. Do you guys all feel modern today? Anybody here feeling traditional? The truth of the matter is, go where you find Christ. There's nothing wrong with being traditional. There's nothing wrong with being modern. There's nothing wrong with our praise service. We all have different backgrounds, different things that ring our bell, that light our fire. And that's why we're doing things this way, so that everybody can find a meaningful way to connect with Christ in community, in church. I call what we have, not just in this church, but in culture in general, buffet Christianity. Right? We have so many different things we can choose from. I'll give you another example. The potato chip. For those of you who are of a certain age, You may remember that when you went to the grocery store to get potato chips, and you went to the potato chip area, they had potato chips. You got potato chips, right? Then along came the Pringle, and it changed the world. Now when you walk, you go to the Safeway down here, and the potato chip aisle goes the entire length of the store. They've got sour cream and jalapeno and red hot chili and organic and I don't know what else. They have a zillion types of potato chips. You could spend a month on the potato chip aisle going, what do I want? Which is the best potato chip for me? But the truth of the matter is, people have spoken and they say that we really want that jalapeno potato chip. I don't really want the jalapeno potato chip, just so you know. Don't get me that for next Christmas, please. But there's all of these choices. Well, in a way, that's how our church is now. Not just this church, but the Church Universal. We have lots of choices. Buffet Christianity. We can go somewhere else if we want to, or we can stay with our community and find a meaningful voice, but it is kind of the potato chip aisle of churches. And you know what? That's okay. Personally, I usually just go buy potato chips, though I've strayed a little. I've gotten into Ruffles. Let me give you another example of how this might work. At the very first church that I was at, this was before I was ordained, it was kind of a student appointment. They had an average of maybe 15 people in worship. This is way up in the mountains in Colorado. But they had a little praise team. They had a little band that played, and they invited me to come play. And I didn't know anything about Christian music. And the first song that we learned with me kind of hacking away at the guitar was Blessed Be Your Name, the one that the band did to start out the service this morning. Well, I'd never heard of it. Didn't know who Matt Redman was, didn't have a clue. I'm a classically trained musician. I only knew a little bit about, and I thought, uh-oh, this is going to be a problem, right? I loved it. And one of the reasons that I really loved it is because the congregation loved it. That was what they wanted. It rang their bell. It was provided a way for them to become closer to God. Well, then the next year I got my first actual appointment. This time the church averaged about 30 people on Sunday mornings. It was way out on the plains in Colorado, the Eastern Plains. If you've never been there, think Kansas. Okay, it's a lot of wheat. It's not the beautiful Rocky Mountains. There's no skiing out on the plains of Colorado, trust me. But my very first day, literally my very first day at my first appointment, I got a call that said, Florence Plank is in the hospital. She has maybe 24 hours to live. And we'd like you to go visit her. And we'd like you to sing her favorite hymn, Trust and Obey. That old traditional hymn, Trust and Obey, that I had never sung in my life. Okay, so, I go out to the hospital and I go there. Poor Florence is in her bed. She's having kidney problems. And I brought my hymnal and I just, turned to Trust and Obey and Trust and Obey. So I sang it for her. And you know what? It was one of the most beautiful moments I've ever had in ministry. It meant so much to her. And she was slipping in and out of consciousness, but she knew I was there, and the family knew I was there, singing this hymn I'd never heard of before, this old traditional hymn. And boy, I'm telling you, God entered that room. It was fabulous. And later at Florence's funeral, I did her funeral. 2 years later, we all sang Trust and Obey again. It's whatever God opens up for you that will take you to God and take God to you. Why? Remember all those potato chips? What did they all have in common? Potatoes. They're all made out of potatoes. All that Christian stuff, All the things we do here or in Ethiopia or in Mongolia, what do we all have in common? Christ. If we keep Christ at the center, we can sing, "Blessed be your name," or "Trust and obey." We can say a creed or a modern prayer with Christ at the center, with Christ leading us, with that light lit. We are no longer worried or focused on our differences. We are come together in loving kindness and mercy on that path to God. It's like, the old analogy of the path to the mountaintop. Well, maybe there's a lot of paths to the mountaintop. And what's wrong with just waving at the guy over there who's on that other path? They're still going to the mountaintop. That's what I hope we will do here. I hope that if you have to go somewhere on Sunday morning and you have to come to the traditional service, you don't think of it as have to come. You think of it as, oh, wow, a different way to look at and find Christ. And I hope that folks from the traditional service who oversleep or whatever, or who have their electricity go out and oversleep on Sunday mornings, can come to the modern service and go, oh, wow, that's nice. And it's nice, maybe not because it's the music that I love and adore, but it's because Christ is here with us. We're doing this together. We're a community of Christ. I know we can do that. We've done it before. We can do it again. And I hope that you will let folks know in your communities outside of church, your bowling league, your bridge club, whatever it is you're a part of, that they can come to Salmon Creek Church at any time on Sunday and find Christ. After all, it's what we're here for. And it's not just me, it's not just the band, though they are a big help. It's all of us as a community finding Christ together. Because Jesus' truths actually are universal. They were way back then. They still are today. Amen.